What if the neighbors you wave to every day were already dead? The first time Daniel Reeves set foot in Maplewood Lane, he thought he had found the American dream. The neighborhood was exactly the kind of quiet suburb he'd been searching for. Neatly trimmed lawns, identical mailboxes, children's bikes left on driveways, and the faint smell of barbecue drifting through the summer air. After years of bouncing between noisy city apartments and temporary rentals, Daniel wanted permanence. He wanted peace. And Maplewood Lane felt like a snapshot from a postcard, a place so perfectly preserved it was almost eerie. When he pulled up with the moving van, his new neighbors were already waiting. They waved at him in unison, smiles plastered on their faces. There was Mr. and Mrs. Kavanaugh, the elderly couple next door with matching gardening hats, the Parkers across the street, a young family with twin daughters in sundresses. Even the mailman stopped at the corner, tipping his cap with a friendly grin. It was too perfect, too welcoming. Daniel laughed it off, assuming they were just small-town friendly. "Welcome to Maplewood," Mrs. Kavanaugh called out. "We're so glad you're here." Her voice carried strangely across the street, bright, cheerful, but with a sharpness that pricked at Daniel's skin. He forced a smile. "Thanks. Excited to be here." Inside, the house was spotless. The realtor had told him it had been on the market for years, but everything looked freshly polished. Wood floors gleaming, walls pristine, even the faint scent of lavender in the air. It was as if someone had been preparing for his arrival. That night, after unpacking, Daniel stood by the upstairs window. The street was quiet, eerily quiet. Not a single car drove past. Not a single porch light flickered. Yet the neighbors still stood outside their houses, faint silhouettes in the moonlight, and they were still smiling. The next morning, Daniel awoke to the sound of a lawnmower. Looking outside, he saw Mr. Kavanaugh pushing it across his yard with stiff, mechanical movements, smile never faltering. The Parker twins were playing jump rope in the driveway, chanting a rhyme he couldn't quite hear, their voices oddly hollow. When Daniel stepped out with a box of trash, everyone waved at him. Again, at the exact same time. It sent a shiver down his spine. As the day went on, he noticed something stranger. The neighbors' routines never changed. The Kavanaughs trimmed their hedges every morning. The Parkers twins jumped rope every afternoon. The mailman always arrived at 3:15 sharp, every single day. And when the clock struck midnight, the neighborhood fell silent. No crickets, no wind, just silence. That's when Daniel heard it. Footsteps in his attic. He froze at the sound. Slow, deliberate steps pacing back and forth above his head. Heart pounding, he grabbed a flashlight and climbed the ladder to the attic. The air was suffocatingly hot. Dust floated in the beam of light. Boxes lined the walls, untouched. But there were no footprints. No rats. No intruder. And yet the sound continued, right behind him. When he spun around, the flashlight flickered just once. But in that instant, he saw something in the far corner. A man, standing in the shadows, smiling. Daniel's hand shook as the flashlight beam trembled across the attic. For a single, sickening second, he was sure he had seen someone, no, something, standing in the far corner. A tall figure, shoulders bent, with that same awful smile every neighbor wore. But now the corner was empty. The dust hadn't stirred. The boxes looked undisturbed. The silence pressed against his ears until his own heartbeat sounded like a drum in his chest. "Hello?" His voice cracked, swallowed by the oppressive air. He hated how desperate he sounded, like a child calling into the dark for reassurance. Is someone there? Nothing. Just the soft hum of the house settling. Daniel slowly backed down the attic ladder, his palms slick against the rungs. When he shut the hatch, he told himself it was nothing. His imagination fueled by the unsettling perfection of this place. He had been tired, maybe half asleep. He repeated this until the words felt almost believable. But that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that the attic was no longer empty, that something waited up there, smiling in the dark. The following morning, Daniel decided to push away the unease. He had work to do, boxes to unpack, a new life to settle into. He brewed coffee, opened his laptop at the kitchen counter, and tried to focus. But as he worked, he kept glancing out the window. The neighborhood was awake again, moving in its strange, robotic rhythm. The Kavanaughs were trimming their hedges. Again. The Parker twins were bouncing their jump rope. Again. And every time he happened to look, their eyes seemed fixed on him, their smiles unwavering. At 3:15 on the dot, the mailman arrived. He strolled down the street in his neatly pressed uniform, cap angled perfectly, posture stiff as a soldier. He paused in front of Daniel's house, slid a stack of envelopes into the mailbox, and tipped his cap without speaking. Daniel hesitated, then opened the front door. "Hey, thanks." The mailman stopped mid-step, turned his head with unnatural slowness, and gave Daniel a smile that felt stretched too wide. His lips parted, but no sound came out. Then he turned back and walked away, his footsteps echoing too loudly against the pavement. When Daniel checked the mailbox, the letters inside made his stomach clench. They were old, not just postmarked weeks ago, years. Yellowed envelopes, faded ink, some addressed to people who weren't him. Some bore no names at all, just the words, "Return to sender." That evening, Daniel forced himself to be social. Maybe meeting the neighbors would ease his paranoia. He crossed the street and introduced himself to the Parkers. Mr. Parker greeted him with a firm handshake that lingered too long. His wife smiled brightly, though her eyes seemed glassy and distant. The twins giggled, their jump rope slapping the driveway in perfect rhythm, their voices chiming in eerie unison. "What rhyme is that you're singing?" Daniel asked, trying to be polite. The girls froze mid-jump. Their eyes locked onto him, identical smiles stretching wider. Then together they recited in flat, hollow voices. "Round and round the circle goes. Where it stops, nobody knows. Time begins when the clock strikes 1. But when it ends, you can't outrun." The rope hit the ground once more, the sound sharp and final. Then they giggled as if nothing had happened. Daniel excused himself quickly, his skin crawling. That night he tried not to look outside. He sat on the couch, the TV flickering in the dark, though he wasn't watching it. At exactly midnight the sound cut out, the screen fizzed with static. And again, the silence descended. Not natural silence, but a suffocating stillness, as if the entire world had stopped breathing. Daniel rose and peered through the blinds. The neighborhood was frozen. Every single neighbor stood in their yard, facing his house. The Kavanaughs with their hedge clippers still in hand, the Parkers with their twins clutching the rope, the mailman at the corner, all of them unmoving, all of them staring. Daniel stumbled back from the window, heart racing. He didn't know what compelled him, but he crept toward the front door. His hand shook as he reached for the knob. A soft knock came first. Daniel froze. The knock was slow, deliberate. 3 steady taps that reverberated through the empty house. He dared to look through the peephole. The porch was empty. His breath came shallow and fast. He unlocked the door just enough to swing it open. No one was there. But on the welcome mat lay a single envelope. It was yellowed, edges frayed, the handwriting elegant and looping. His name was written across the front. Daniel Reeves. Hands trembling, he opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, blank, except for one line scrawled in red ink. "You're late." Daniel dropped the letter, chest tightening. Late for what? Who had written it? He backed into the living room, eyes darting to every shadow. The house seemed to close in around him, pressing tighter, darker. And then, the attic door creaked open, slowly, deliberately. A shadow spilled down the ladder, stretching across the floor, and a voice, soft and cheerful, drifted down from above. "Welcome home, Daniel." Daniel's blood turned to ice. The attic hatch hung open, the ladder extending downward like an invitation or a trap. He could see nothing above, just blackness, a void that seemed to swallow the faint glow of his flashlight. The voice still echoed in his ears. "Welcome home, Daniel." It wasn't possible. He hadn't told anyone he was moving here. He hadn't even given his forwarding address to friends yet. So who, or what, could possibly be waiting in his attic? His first instinct was to run, to grab his car keys, tear out of Maplewood Lane, and never look back. But when he glanced at the window, his stomach dropped. The neighbors were still standing there. All of them. Their faces tilted upward, eyes fixed on his house, their smiles wide and gleaming in the pale wash of moonlight. Not one of them moved, not even to blink. It was as if they were waiting for him to go up. Daniel's chest tightened. His rational brain screamed, "Get out! Leave! Run now!" But his body disobeyed, drawn forward step by step, as though some invisible hand were guiding him. The first rung of the ladder creaked beneath his weight. His flashlight flickered again, and for the briefest moment, he swore he saw a figure leaning just out of sight, as if crouched at the top, waiting. Then the attic hatch slammed shut on its own, shaking the ceiling. The sound reverberated through the house like thunder. Daniel staggered back, nearly falling, his breath coming in ragged gasps. And in that instant, as the silence returned, he realized something far worse. The letter, the one that had said, "You're late." It wasn't lying on the welcome mat anymore. It was gone. The next morning, Daniel woke up in his bed, drenched in sweat. He didn't remember falling asleep. He didn't even remember climbing under the covers. All he remembered was the attic door slamming. But daylight brought with it a false sense of safety. The neighborhood looked normal again, if Maplewood Lane could ever be called normal. The Kavanaughs were back at their hedge, the Parkers twins chanting their rhyme, the mailman striding down the street at 3:15 exactly. Daniel needed answers. He pulled out his phone, searching the house's address, hoping to find its history. Nothing. The real estate listing existed, sure, but there were no records before that. No previous owners, no sales history, no property taxes. It was like the house had appeared from thin air. Frustrated, he drove downtown to the county records office. He spent hours digging through archives, but Maplewood Lane barely existed on paper. A few scattered references in zoning documents, but no maps, no census data, nothing substantial. It was like the entire street had been erased, or worse, never existed at all. When Daniel returned, the sun was already dipping below the horizon. He pulled into his driveway and noticed something odd. His mailbox flag was up. Inside was another envelope. His name, again, written in elegant script. His hands shook as he tore it open. This time there were more words. "You must follow the rules. Midnight is not yours to ignore." Beneath it was a list, hastily scrawled. 1. Never go outside after midnight. 2. Never invite them in. 3. Always wave back. 4. Don't look in the attic. Daniel's breath caught. Someone was watching him, someone who knew exactly what he had done. His eyes darted around the street. Every neighbor was in their yard, smiling, still, watching. And when his gaze landed on them, they all raised their hands in a perfectly synchronized wave. Daniel didn't wave back. That night, he sat awake in the living room staring at the envelope, waiting for something to happen. And right at midnight, the world shifted. The silence fell heavy again. The TV went black, the clock stopped ticking, and the neighbors outside turned toward his house in unison. This time, however, there was no knock on the door. Instead, there was the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling his house. Gravel crunching under invisible weight. The sound moved from window to window, pausing at each one as if someone, or something, were peering inside. Daniel sat frozen on the couch, clutching the flashlight. The footsteps reached the back door. The handle jiggled. Then a voice whispered through the crack of the frame. "Why didn't you wave?" Daniel's stomach dropped. He stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the coffee table. The whisper was childlike, high-pitched, but wrong, like two voices speaking at once. He covered his ears, but the whisper came again, this time from the front window. "Why didn't you wave?" The curtain stirred, though the windows were shut tight. A pale hand pressed against the glass from the outside, leaving no smudge, no fingerprint, just a faint impression that faded as quickly as it appeared. The whisper came a third time, now directly behind him, though the room was empty. "Why didn't you wave?" Daniel turned, swinging the flashlight wildly. The beam cut across the living room, across the stairs, across the attic ladder, which was now open again. From above, faintly, came the sound of that same jump rope rhyme. "Round and round the circle goes," the Parker twins' voices echoing through his attic. Daniel's legs nearly gave out beneath him. He bolted for the door, but when he yanked it open, his breath caught in his throat. The neighbors were all standing at the foot of his porch. Every single one of them. Their faces inches from his, eyes wide and glassy, smiles stretched into inhuman grins. And in perfect unison, they spoke, their voices blending into one. "You're late, Daniel." Daniel staggered backward, his hand still gripping the doorknob. The entire neighborhood stood before him, pressed together in a silent wall of bodies at the edge of his porch. Their eyes gleamed with unnatural light in the moon's pale wash, their smiles carved too deep, too fixed, as if the muscles of their faces had been locked into permanent cheer. The Parker twins stood front and center, their jump rope coiled neatly in their hands. The Kavanaughs were behind them, hedge clippers in hand, though the blades glinted with something far too red. The mailman was there too, cap tilted low, empty satchel hanging from his side like a corpse's limb. And as one, they whispered, "You're late, Daniel." The words rattled through his bones, as though the air itself carried them into his marrow. He slammed the door shut, locking the deadbolt with trembling hands. His breath came in ragged bursts, heart hammering against his ribs. He pressed his back to the wood as if his weight alone could hold them back. But the porch remained silent. No pounding fists, no scratching. Just silence. Daniel dared to peek through the peephole. The porch was empty. His breath hitched. He spun toward the window. The street was empty too. Every lawn, every driveway, abandoned. No Parker twins, no Kavanaughs, no mailman. The world had returned to stillness, as if nothing had happened. But when he looked down, the envelope that had contained the rules was gone from the coffee table. In its place was a new one, yellowed like the others, his name written in that elegant looping script. With shaking hands, he opened it. Inside were only two words: "Wave now." The next morning, Daniel told himself it had to be a dream. Sleep deprivation, stress, an overactive imagination. But the truth gnawed at him. He hadn't slept properly in days, and each night bled into the next like one continuous fever dream. Still, he tried to convince himself of normalcy. He mowed the lawn, he unpacked boxes, he even forced himself to wave to Mrs. Kavanaugh when she looked over from her hedge. She waved back, her smile as rigid as ever, but at least, for the first time, he felt a flicker of relief. That relief didn't last. At 3:15, the mailman came. Daniel braced himself standing at the window. He made sure to wave. The mailman paused, tipped his cap, and smiled. Too wide, too sharp. Then he slid a single envelope into the mailbox and walked away. Daniel opened it immediately. Inside was a short message. "Tonight, the visitors arrive. Do not answer the door." The warning burned in his mind for the rest of the day. He couldn't focus on anything else. The rules had told him never to go outside after midnight, never to invite anyone in. But who were the visitors? And why was he the one receiving these warnings? When midnight came, he sat in the living room with every light on, clutching his flashlight like a weapon. The silence fell again, the oppressive, suffocating silence. Then came the sound. Not footsteps this time. Wheels. The steady, squeaking wheels of something rolling down Maplewood Lane. Daniel crept to the window and peered through the blinds. At the far end of the street, a black carriage rolled slowly forward, pulled by two horses darker than shadow. The carriage glistened as though wet, though no rain fell. It moved soundlessly over the asphalt, wheels turning but never touching the ground. The neighbors emerged from their houses in perfect unison, lining the sidewalks, bowing their heads as the carriage passed. Their smiles vanished for the first time, replaced with solemn silence. Daniel's heart thundered in his chest. He dropped the blinds and stumbled back. The carriage was coming closer. He could feel it, like the pull of a tide. Moments later, it stopped in front of his house. The knock came immediately. 3 slow, deliberate raps against the door. Daniel clutched the flashlight tighter, every nerve in his body screaming to ignore it. Do not answer the door. He remembered the warning. He held his breath, pressing his back against the wall, praying they would leave. But the knock came again, louder this time. Then a voice drifted through the wood, low and commanding, carrying an accent Daniel couldn't place. Daniel Reeves. Open the door. You are expected. His blood ran cold. They knew his name. The doorknob twisted violently, rattling against the lock. Daniel stumbled backward, his throat dry. The pounding grew louder, shaking the frame, until dust rained from the ceiling. And then, silence. Daniel dared to peek through the peephole. The porch was empty. But when he turned, his stomach dropped. The carriage wasn't outside anymore. It was inside. It stood impossibly in the middle of his living room, its black wood gleaming, its horses pawing at the floor, though no sound echoed. The door of the carriage creaked open, darkness spilling out like ink. From within, a hand extended, pale skeletal fingers curling in invitation, and a voice, smooth and patient, whispered from the abyss, "You belong here now." Daniel stumbled back, nearly tripping over his coffee table. His flashlight beam caught the edges of the carriage, but the light seemed to die the moment it touched the darkness spilling from its door. He could feel the pull of it, like gravity, dragging him forward against his will. He turned and bolted for the front door. His hands fumbled with the lock, yanking it open. But the porch wasn't Maplewood Lane anymore. It was endless rows of gravestones, stretching into a fog-choked night, and every gravestone bore the same inscription: Daniel Reeves. Daniel slammed the door shut, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with tears of panic. He pressed his back against the wood, as though he could somehow lock out the impossible sight of the graveyard that stretched endlessly beyond his porch. The images carved into his mind refused to fade, rows upon rows of gravestones, each etched with his name, each one waiting for him. The room was silent now. No carriage, no horses, no skeletal hand reaching out. But the air carried the faint metallic tang of soil and decay, as though something had followed him back inside. He stumbled into the kitchen, grabbed a glass of water, and gulped it down with shaking hands. When he set the glass on the counter, his breath caught. The condensation on the glass had formed words, running down in faint droplets. "You can't run." Daniel hurled the glass into the sink, where it shattered violently, the sound unnaturally loud in the still house. He stood there, clutching the counter, whispering to himself over and over, "This isn't real. This isn't real. It can't be real." But deep down, he knew it was. He needed answers. Someone had to know what Maplewood Lane really was. The envelopes, the warnings, someone was leaving them. Someone was watching him, but maybe not all of the neighbors were part of it. Maybe someone else was trapped here too. The next day, Daniel forced himself outside, the sunlight almost blinding after so many sleepless nights. The neighbors were already in their places. The Kavanaughs trimmed their hedges. The Parker twins jumped rope, their lips moving in silent rhyme. The mailman strode down the street at 3:15 sharp, letters tucked neatly in his satchel. But one house caught Daniel's eye, the very end of the cul-de-sac. Its windows were dark, its lawn overgrown, weeds breaking through the cracks in the driveway. No one waved from the porch. Daniel walked toward it, his palms sweating, every step feeling like it drew every pair of eyes on the street. He knocked once. No answer. He knocked again. Finally, the door creaked open. A gaunt woman stood in the shadows, her hair disheveled, eyes bloodshot. Unlike the others, she didn't smile. She didn't wave. She simply stared at him with a hollow expression, as if she hadn't spoken to anyone in years. "Please," Daniel whispered, desperate. "What is this place? What's happening here?" Her lips trembled, and for a long moment, Daniel thought she wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice so soft it was almost drowned by the summer breeze, she said, "You shouldn't have moved here." She let him in, locking the door quickly behind them. Inside, the house was dark, curtains drawn, air thick with dust. Piles of unopened mail lay scattered across the floor, letters just like the ones Daniel had been receiving. The walls were covered in scribbled notes, written in frantic handwriting. "Don't wave. Don't open the door. Don't look at the graves." The woman sank into a chair, rubbing her temples. "I tried to leave once," she muttered. "I packed my car, drove all the way to the highway, but no matter which road I took, I ended up back here. Maplewood doesn't let you leave." Daniel's stomach turned cold. "What is Maplewood?" She looked at him then, her bloodshot eyes glistening with tears. "It's not a neighborhood. It's a loop, a pocket between places. We're not supposed to be here, Daniel. We're supposed to be somewhere else." He shook his head. "A loop? Between what?" Her voice cracked as she whispered, "Between life and death." Daniel staggered back, his chest tight. "You're saying we're dead?" The woman shook her head violently. "Not dead. Not alive either. Caught in between. Stuck in the moment after death and before whatever comes next. That's why everything here repeats. That's why the neighbors smile. They're echoes, reflections of what they were." Daniel's mind reeled. "But why me? I didn't die. I just moved in. She cut him off with a bitter laugh that dissolved into a sob. "You think you chose to move here? None of us chose. We arrived the same way. We thought we'd found a house, a home, a fresh start. But the truth is, Maplewood chooses you. It picks the lost ones, the broken ones, the ones closest to the edge." Daniel's throat went dry. He thought of the car accident months ago, the one that had left him in the hospital for weeks. The doctor had said he was lucky to survive, that he had been inches from death. Was this why? Was Maplewood the inches he had never truly escaped? Before he could speak, a sound rattled through the house. A slow, deliberate knock on the door. The woman's face drained of color. She clutched Daniel's arm with a force that made his bones ache. "Don't answer it," she hissed. "Whatever you do, don't." But the knocking grew louder. 3 sharp raps echoing through the walls like gunshots. Then a voice, the same smooth, commanding voice that had spoken from the carriage. "Open the door, Margaret. You've kept him long enough." The woman, Margaret, shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face. "They've come for you, Daniel. They'll keep coming until you open it, until you take your place." The knocking shook the frame. Dust fell from the ceiling. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the force of the demand. Margaret shoved Daniel toward the back of the house. "Go! Get out! Before they break through!" Daniel stumbled down the hallway, but when he looked back, his heart froze. The front door was slowly opening on its own, and beyond it, silhouetted in the threshold, stood the black carriage. Its door was already open. Inside, the darkness pulsed like a living thing, and this time, a figure stepped out. What if the neighbors you wave to every day were already dead? Daniel Reeves stumbled through the empty street of Maplewood Lane, his lungs burning, his mind spiraling. He had run for what felt like hours, but the houses never changed. Every street corner led him back to the same cul-de-sac, the same smiling neighbors, the same suffocating silence. Only now, those neighbors were no longer just waving. They stood motionless in the pale moonlight, their grins stretched impossibly wide, their hollow eyes fixed on him. The Kavanaughs with their gardening shears. The Parker twins with their jump rope hanging limp in their hands. Even the mailman, his uniform frozen in time, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. They all stepped forward at once. Daniel's breath came in ragged gasps. "What do you want from me?" he shouted into the night, his voice cracking. The neighborhood answered, not in words but in unison. Dozens of voices, layered and echoing, spilling from every throat at once. "Stay!" The sound rattled the air like a hive of insects, vibrating in Daniel's bones. He clamped his hands over his ears, but the voices weren't coming from outside anymore. They were inside his head. Memories flickered, moving in day, the realtor's smile, the "Welcome to Maplewood" banner on his lawn, the house that looked as though it had been waiting just for him. And then, a chilling thought. What if it had? Daniel bolted back into his house, slamming the door shut. His heart hammered in his chest as he leaned against it, trying to catch his breath. The walls seemed to close in tighter with every passing second, the lavender scent now sickly sweet, clinging to his throat. The footsteps in the attic returned. Slow, deliberate, heavy. With trembling hands, Daniel grabbed the flashlight again. He knew he shouldn't go up there. He knew what waited. But some part of him, some small, terrified part, needed the truth. The attic ladder creaked under his weight as he climbed. The light swept across the dust, the old boxes, the rafters. And then, there he was, the man, standing in the corner, smiling. But as Daniel raised the beam higher, the man's face came into full view. It wasn't a stranger. It was Daniel. Daniel staggered backward, nearly falling off the ladder. His own face stared back at him from the shadows, eyes lifeless, skin pale, smile frozen. The double stepped forward, speaking in Daniel's own voice, but hollow, empty. "You don't belong here. You never did. But you wouldn't leave. And now you can't." The attic walls pulsed with whispers, the same word again and again. Stay. 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 The truth crashed over Daniel like icy water. The neighborhood wasn't alive. It never had been. Maplewood Lane was a graveyard disguised as a suburb, a place where the dead lived their perfect routines in an endless loop. And he had joined them the moment he moved in, the realtor, the smiles, the house waiting for him. It hadn't been chance. It had been a trap. He tried to scream, but no sound came. The attic floor beneath him softened, turning to mist. His body felt heavy, his vision dimming as though the neighborhood was pulling him down, absorbing him into its endless cycle. Below, through the attic window, Daniel saw the neighbors watching, waiting. Their smiles widened as his body froze mid-step, his expression locking into a grin he couldn't control. The attic grew brighter, not with light, but with something else, something consuming. And then, silence. The next morning, Maplewood Lane woke as it always did. The Kavanaughs trimmed their hedges. The Parker twins jumped rope. The mailman arrived at exactly 3:15. And at the house on the corner, Daniel Reeves stood on the porch, smiling, waving at the new family that had just pulled up in their moving van. "Welcome to Maplewood," he said, his voice cheerful, his grin unblinking.